Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on the last one here. This is by far, I think, the most interesting because here we're really putting it all together, but I will say it is a little bit more complex. So if we have questions, just raise your hand and we'll go ahead and try to address them while we're talking. So as we've detailed previously, we're really looking at about 268,000 North Carolina high school graduates in this analysis. Specifically, we're looking at all high school graduates who graduated between 2009 and 2011. And in the first memo, we talked about access. And so we looked at college going, and we saw 67% of those were enrolled in a post-secondary program. And here we're using the May 15th, 2012 cutoff that we introduced in the completion memo. Of those, 76% persisted to their second year, which was persistence was the focus of the second data brief. And then 51% received a post-secondary degree or credential within 6 years of their first enrollment. So we're anchoring the completion part on high school completion. And so that means then that 33% did not enroll in a post-secondary program by May 15th, 2012. And so what we saw here is that, this is really top level, and there are different ways to the same outcome point. And there's also different implications when we start to look at the big picture, kind of the global picture. And so first and foremost, I just wanted to highlight how, depending on whether we're looking at this from within the cohort that went to college versus all graduates. So we're looking at the cumulative impact now of each of these transition points. And so we're seeing that 67% enrolled, that's 67 out of every 100 high school graduates enrolled by May 15th, 2012. And when you take that 76% persistence rate among those who were enrolled, that really means that's 51 of every 100 high school graduates both enrolled and then persisted to their second year. And then with that 51% graduation rate or completion rate is actually 34% of all high school graduates. So this is where we start to say, well, this is what it means within the school, but let's look back and say, how does this actually impact all high school graduates? So we're ending up with now we're going to step back and look at the whole population of graduates and not just what's going on inside the university system. So we're seeing that 34 out of every 100 North Carolina high school graduates between 2009 and 2011 enrolled in a post-secondary program by May 15th, 2012, and then went on to earn a degree or credential within 6 years of that first enrollment. And this leaves us with kind of three large outcome groups, and they're pretty evenly split across. The largest group is the post-secondary success outcome group. That's about 34% of students who enrolled and received a degree or credential. We have the second largest group is 33% of students, just over 88,000, who enrolled by that May 15th date, but did not earn a degree or credential within 6 years of enrollment. Some of these students do go on to earn a degree within 7 to 9 years, but we don't have sufficient data on all of the cohorts to really look that far ahead. We also know that some of them stopped out after just one semester and never returned. Some are still enrolled but have not received a degree. So there's a lot of nuance within that group. And then we have almost 88,000, another 33%, who were not enrolled by May 15th of 2012. Again, some of these students will go on after that to enroll in a college or university and complete a degree, but we were not able to include that information in this evaluation because it occurred outside of, we'd need more years of data to start to look at those students. And when we look across these three outcome groups, we see some pretty clear clustering on two major factors, which is academic readiness, measured by high school GPA, and economic disadvantage, measured by free and reduced price lunch eligibility. And so this bar chart highlights that across all of these high school graduates, the average high school GPA was 2.74, and about 34%, or 1 in every 3, was eligible for free or reduced price lunch. Among our post-secondary success outcome group, we see much higher average high school GPAs, and they're about half as likely to have been eligible for free or reduced price lunch. Among both of our other outcome groups, we see lower GPAs, higher rates of economic disadvantage, but it's important to note that the never enrolled or not enrolled by that date have both the lowest average high school GPAs and the highest rates of economic disadvantage. We know that these two factors are also very tightly interrelated, but they're consistently going to be popping up throughout the brief as major underlying forces. We know that academic readiness and then capacity to pay for college are really two of the biggest factors in persistence and completion. So I want to drill down now on some of the ways that people are getting to these big outcome groups, because we're looking at one outcome group, and I will say we tried a couple ways at first, and pathways were so idiosyncratic for individuals that my software package actually would not render all of the data and show it to us. So just to highlight that we're trying to bucket this and bracket this down, but there's a lot of nuance on complexity and how an individual navigates this process. So we're defining degree completion pathways by 3 indicators. The first is time to degree completion. So on time is 100% of normal time. So that's 2 years for an associate degree or credential, or 4 years for a bachelor's degree. Extended is 150% of normal time. So that's 3 years or 6 years respectively. And then very extended is then 200% of normal time or more. So that is for, here we can only apply that to individuals who are earning an associate degree or post-secondary credential, are taking 4 to 6 years to earn that degree. In comparison, bachelor's degrees, we'd need 8 years of data to fully evaluate that degree completion rate. The second thing we have is the institution awarding the degree. So traditional here, we're defining as they earned their first degree or credential from the first institution that they enrolled at. Transfer indicates that their awarding institution is different than the initial institution of enrollment. And then the type of degree earned, we're using a shorthand for 4-year means a bachelor's degree, and 2-year is associate or a credential. And when you put this together, we actually have 10 unique combinations because, again, we don't have very extended outcomes for the 4-year students. This is just a top line look at that table that is in the post-secondary pathways document. But I want to drill down now to kind of the top 5 pathways that we see that comprise this outcome group. So the first pathway is what we would often call kind of our traditional college students. This is the on-time traditional 4-year pathway. So they graduate within 4 years. They graduate from the same institution that they started at, and they get a bachelor's degree. That's 40% of all students who are in this post-secondary success outcome group. They had the highest average high school GPA, almost a 3.5, and they're the least likely to be economically disadvantaged, to start part-time, or to take any breaks. So that's stopping out, is that they took a temporary break and then resumed enrollment. So this is our kind of classic model of college-going behavior that often, I think, as you'll see, does not apply to everybody else. So then our second most common was 21% of students were what we'll call the extended traditional 4-year. So this means that these are students who took more than 4 years to complete a bachelor's degree, but earned a bachelor's degree within 6 years from the same institution that they first enrolled at. They look very similar to the on-time graduate group, but slightly lower average high school GPA, 3.21 versus 3.47. They're much more likely to stop out, so about 13% stop out versus a very small portion of the other group, but they generally only take about 1 semester break. Our next most common pathway is the extended transfer 4-year pathway. So 9% of all students in the post-secondary success pathway took 4 to 6 years to complete a bachelor's degree. And they earned this degree from an institution that was different from the institution that they first enrolled at. They had the lowest average high school GPA of these 3 outcome groups. They're much more likely to stop out, and that stop frequently occurred before changing. So they may have attended one semester, taken a semester break, and then the fall semester of the next year, they're enrolling at a different school, and then they're continuing there until they graduate. Like I said, that break generally occurred before they changed, and they were much more likely to have 2 or more semester breaks than the extended traditional 4-year students. And we are seeing a couple different types of transitions here. The most common being the community college into the UNC system. So we're seeing very clearly for many students that the community colleges are a stepping stone to a bachelor's degree. We're also seeing within the UNC system, and then from a private 4-year institution in-state to the UNC system. And if you recall from the pathways, from the persistence memo, actually, what we saw was that one of the big factors in predicting kind of continuing education, but changing institutions was financial capacity. And those students were very likely to continue, but to shift from a higher cost to a lower cost institution. So there could be some of that going on in this group of students. The next 2 top 5 pathways I'm going to cluster together because they're very similar in certain respects. And these are both what we're calling the very extended 2-year pathways, meaning that these students took more than 4 years to earn an associate degree or credential. And about 8% of them earned that credential or degree from the first institution that they enrolled at. Another 6% earned that from a transfer from a different institution. These students as a group had much higher rates of stop out. So almost half of students in these outcome groups, in these pathways, took breaks, and extended breaks were much more common. They had lower average high school GPAs. And when we look at the traditional, when we compare these 2-year very extended pathways, looking at the traditional students who did not change schools versus those who transferred, traditional students had lower GPAs, they're more disadvantaged, meaning higher rates of free and reduced price lunch eligibility, and they were more likely to begin part-time. Very just consistent with the fact that they are tending to be students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. So I did just get one question about how we define stop out, and a stop out means that they had to be enrolled and then having a full term where they were not enrolled anywhere. So it is a break of at least 1 semester. And we're only focusing on kind of fall and spring terms here, and we're excluding summer terms from this analysis because that would just, everybody would be stopping out or having kind of partial enrollment. So if they were enrolled in the fall and then the spring and then not enrolled the following fall, that would be a stop out. And if they enrolled the following spring, that would be 1 semester stop out. And if they did not enroll again until the next year, that would be 2 semesters. I hope that helped more than it added confusion. And so within this, we're seeing kind of, again, we're seeing within system transfer pathways, we're seeing within the community college system transfers, and we are also seeing that second most common is from the UNC system to the community college system. And again, going back to that persistence memo, if you recall there, one of the most common factors associated with lack of first-year persistence or retention at the first institution and then changing was academic readiness. And many of those students ended up going from a 4-year institution to a 2-year institution. So there could be some of that going on there. And a combination of both academic readiness and financial capacity may be driving that third group, which is the transition from the private in-state institutions, 4-year in-state, to the community college system. So overall, we're seeing that 84% of all students in the post-secondary success pathway are, or the post-secondary success outcome group are in one of the top 5 pathways. And the other 5 pathways make up about 16%, but I'm not going to go into those in detail to move on to focus on the pathways to some post-secondary, no degree. So this one's a little bit more complicated because these are students who have not received a degree, and we really only have there's only two major ways that we decided to cut the data for this purposes, although we can drill down even further if additional analysis becomes requested. So we are focusing really on the institution attended, so whether or not they were at the same school for all terms that they were enrolled, or if they changed schools. And note, I'm using the term changed here, not transfer, because the other pathways to success were generally much more consistent with a transfer pathway, where students are starting at one institution, are much more likely to have seamless enrollment into another institution, and then are completing a degree within some sort of regular amount of time. Here, we're seeing students are often changing after very short amounts of time and more extended breaks. So changing is probably more likely what's going on than transferring, although I can't guarantee that. And we can't really understand official transfers in the data. And then there's continuity of enrollment. So whether they were continuously enrolled until they left, or if they're still enrolled, or if they took any breaks between terms of enrollment. So it's important to note here that continuous enrollment does also include terms of enrollment of only one term. So if students who are only enrolled one semester will be continuously enrolled at the same school. Again, this can be further drilled down on, but we're going to keep it pretty high level for right now. Again, this gives 4 unique combinations of pathways. And among these 4 pathways, what we see here is that the most common, 40% of this outcome group, were at the same school with continuous enrollment. More than half of these students are leaving within 1 year, and they never come back into post-secondary. They're the least likely group to earn a degree within 6 years. They had the lowest average high school GPA, and they're also the most disadvantaged, so the highest rates of economic disadvantage. And this, again, is really consistent with what we've seen in research that suggests that, this is going to be the double whammy of low academic readiness as well as low financial capacity to actually pay for school. So these students are really facing 2 real challenges, and they enroll, they're likely to be there for 1 to 2 terms, and then they leave and they're not coming back. About 27% changed schools with a stop out. So most left within 1 year. So again, we're seeing that much like the first outcome group of the same school continuous enrollment, most of the changed schools stop out is happening, they're stopping out within 1 to 2 terms. But then rather than leaving post-secondary entirely, they are going to be returning to post-secondary at some time, but generally at a different institution. I don't have as much detail here on kind of place to place because it's a little bit harder to get into that. But we're seeing, again, kind of 2 year to 2 year, 4 to 2 year, and then 2 to 4 years. So there's a lot of kind of, these are very different paths than within this pathway. We do see that this group does have the second highest 6+ year completion rate, meaning that they don't earn a degree within 6 years, but they're earning one within 7 to 9. And what we saw in this group is that they have a higher average high school GPA than other pathways in this outcome group, which may help to counteract the high rates of disadvantage that they have. So we are seeing that high rates of academic readiness or higher academic readiness can buffer economic disadvantage, but we're still going to see disparities within that group. The other thing that we're seeing is about 18% of students, the third most common pathway within this outcome group, were at the same school, but they stopped out. Again, we're seeing that most of the stopping out, most of this breaking is in the first year, which is consistent with the idea that that first term, that first year is really the highest point of vulnerability for students, and that being ready for that first term is really critical to their long-term success. About over half of them took a stop out after 1 or 2 terms, and most of those that took really extended breaks of 1 year or more. So this, again, these students are often coming back. Some of them are going to be getting a degree, but some of them are coming back, attending school for a fair amount of time, and often leaving without a degree or credential. And then about 15% of students in this outcome group change schools with continuous enrollment. So this means that they had been continuously enrolled for more than 6 years. And this was the most likely to earn a degree in 6+ years. About 12.5% of these students have earned a degree, but did not earn it within 6 years. Versus these 3 other pathways in this outcome group, they had the highest average high school GPA and the lowest economic disadvantage. So they're the least likely to begin part-time. So we are seeing that although this group as a whole is less academically ready, less economically advantaged compared to the post-secondary success group, higher rates of academic readiness and economic advantage within this group tend to be associated with better outcomes. And then the one last thing that we did do was we also had so much data that we thought it was really important to look at this in a slightly different way and bring together where these leaks occur so that we can highlight how these transition points are different across each group, but then how those different transition points can either sometimes compound or narrow the overall differences in outcomes. So we did do a supplement called Bringing It All Together, looking at the leaks in the pipeline and really showing where the transition points lead to different losses for different groups. And I wanted to just highlight one of the figures from that supplement, which is post-secondary outcomes by race and ethnicity. So again, we're looking at like 100% of high school graduates, then to the share that are enrolled, then the share of those that persisted to their second year and then completed. And you can see that obviously the gaps exist fairly large from the beginning, from that college access piece. And then they, in some cases, kind of stay the same. Other cases widen and other cases narrow somewhat, but they point to different potential interventions for different groups. And what we saw, for example, is that enrollment is by far the largest driver of gaps for our Hispanic students. They do fairly well once they're enrolled in college, but they just aren't enrolling at the same rates as other groups. In contrast, we see that persistence represents a large loss for American Indian and Black students. And one of the things that we did reference in this memo is that there are some strong studies suggesting that for American Indian students in particular, there are some very different needs and some very different drivers of need on campus than for maybe other groups of students. And I would just strongly recommend, if you want to look into that more closely, we have some references in that memo. And then importantly here for our Black students, graduation was kind of an equally large driver of gaps as persistence. So our Black students are enrolling at very high rates, and then there's significant loss between enrollment and persistence, and then between persistence and completion. And so these are just very different potential interventions for these 3 minority groups compared to potential broader interventions that would impact all students. So just to sum up the overall major findings, I think is that first and foremost, what we often think of as traditional college going behavior that kind of gets talked about as this traditional college pathway of 4 years, you know, immediately go to college, take 4 years and get a bachelor's degree from the same institution at which you started. We know that that's not the most common, but we can now quantify how much. So it's 40% of the post-secondary success outcome group. It is the most common among students who are earning a degree, but that means it's just 20% of students who ever began post-secondary, and just 14% of all high school graduates. So I think it's important to keep in mind for the commission that most students are following really idiosyncratic pathways through post-secondary. And what we saw was that pathways to an associate degree or a post-secondary credential are very distinct from those for bachelor's degree earners. Those students are much more likely to start part-time, they're much more likely to take breaks, And an idea of an on-time kind of 2 to 3 year graduation rate often is not consistent with the way that these students are enrolling and completing college. And across all pathways, they're consistently pointing to barriers of both academic readiness and economic capacity. But the big takeaway here as well is that there are multiple points at which students are exiting the post-secondary pipeline. And these points of exit are slightly different for different groups. And the more that you drill down, the more that you can start to see different possible intervention points for different groups of students. And I think that what that really does for me is highlight the many potential opportunities for intervention that exist across the transition from high school into post-secondary and throughout the post-secondary career. So thank you so much for sticking with this. I found this really, I really liked working on this, so I hope that we have some interesting conversation if people still have time to ask some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. That's ton of stuff in today's presentation. So we can leave it open for questions. We've only got a couple of more minutes. I'm trying to be respectful of everyone's time. You can unmute yourself or just throw one in the chat, and I can ask it. And also a reminder that the full presentation is on our website at myfuturenc.org under resources. All 4 are there, and also via YouTube. You can go back and watch any of the past 3, or today's will be up in a couple of days. But we still have a couple of minutes if anybody wants further clarification on anything.
And I'm also going to put up our email here. So I know that you've only had a few days to review this and it's pretty chewy material. So if you want to spend some time with it and shoot a question our way, definitely we'd love to engage with you that way as well.
All right, well, so things are quiet in the chat and quiet over the phone. So I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks to everybody that joined. Becky, thanks to you. And just a reminder to everybody that we will be off next week, but back Tuesday, November 6th, different time also, but we'll be sending out an email to everybody with more details about registering. You're gonna have to re-register and different time, different topic, shaking things up, but that'll be Tuesday, November 6th. So thanks to everybody and have a good day.
Thank you.